The rain had no business being this beautiful. That was the first thought I had when I stepped off the bus at Rue Dauphine, my single rolling suitcase catching in the gap between the curb and the gutter, the whole city of New Orleans exhaling a warm, wet breath against my face. The second thought was more practical. I had $42, a duffel bag of bartending uniforms, and a folded piece of paper with an address that was supposed to be my new beginning. Neither of those thoughts prepared me for what came next. My name is Sarah Calloway, and I have always had a talent for arriving in the wrong place at exactly the right moment. 3 months ago, I had a life in Chicago. A small one, the kind that fits neatly into a studio apartment and a 5-year plan. But mine. A bartending job at a decent hotel. A savings account that was finally beginning to look like something. A cat named Biscuit who tolerated me with aristocratic indifference. Then, the hotel was bought. The new owners renovated the bar into a private lounge for members only. My savings account paid for my mother's emergency surgery, and Biscuit, in an act of philosophical solidarity, went to live with my neighbor. So, New Orleans. A city that understood reinvention. The address on the paper was for a place called the Midnight Lace, a cocktail bar in the French Quarter that a recruiter had described over the phone as upscale and discreet. I had translated this, from the particular fluency I'd developed working in hospitality, to mean expensive and complicated. Both turned out to be understatements so profound they bordered on comedy. I found the bar. It was on a narrow street that seemed to exist slightly outside the logic of the surrounding city, the kind of alley where gas lamps still burned even in the 21st century, where the wrought iron balconies above were draped in something that wasn't quite ivy and wasn't quite shadow. The door was heavy, dark mahogany, and it opened before I touched it. The man on the other side was enormous, not tall and broad in the way that weight-room regulars are, more like a cliff face in a suit. He looked at me the way old stone looks at rain. "Sarah Calloway," I said, holding up the paper. "I'm the new hire." He moved aside without a word. The interior of the Midnight Lace was everything the exterior promised, and several things it hadn't mentioned. The ceilings were cathedral high. The booths were upholstered in deep burgundy velvet. The lighting was amber and low, the kind designed to make everyone look like a painting from the wrong century. And it was full, even at 6 in the evening, with the most quietly unsettling clientele I had ever seen. I had worked in hotel bars long enough to develop a taxonomy of guests. There were the business travelers nursing single malts alone, the couples celebrating anniversaries with manufactured laughter, the regulars who ordered the same thing every Thursday, the ones who were clearly meeting someone they shouldn't be meeting. These guests fit none of those categories. They sat with the particular stillness of people who have never once been in a hurry, because they have learned, at some cellular level, that time is not a resource they need to manage. They were beautiful in the way that made you want to look away. Not because it was unpleasant. Because it was too much. Like staring at the sun, the woman behind the bar was around 40, with dark auburn hair pinned up, and the precise economy of movement that meant 20 years of professional service. She looked up when I approached, and something in her face shifted from assessment to something I couldn't name yet. "You're the Calloway girl," she said. It wasn't a question. "Sarah," I confirmed. "I'm supposed to start tonight." "You are." She extended a hand. "Margot, I run the floor. Let me tell you 3 things before you touch a single bottle." She held up one finger. "You do not ask the guests questions beyond their order." A second finger. "Whatever you see behind that door," she tilted her head toward a dark panel at the back of the bar, "you didn't see it." A third, "and you do not, under any circumstances, draw attention to yourself when he is in the room." I should have asked who he was. I didn't. because that was my other talent, the one that had gotten me into trouble in Chicago, in the apartment before Chicago, and in the small coastal town in Maine where I'd grown up. I had a catastrophic tendency to find out things the hard way. I was 3 hours into my first shift, and I had already learned that the clientele tipped in a way that defied the standard hospitality mathematics, that the bourbon selection behind the bar included bottles that had no labels I recognized, and that Margot's 3 rules were less guidelines and more survival instructions. I was reaching for a high shelf when the temperature dropped, not metaphorically. The actual air in the room changed, a subtle but unmistakable drop of several degrees, the way a room feels when a window opens onto winter. I heard it in the ice behind the bar, the soft, crystalline settling of cubes that hadn't been disturbed. I heard it in the silence that replaced the low murmur of conversation, not the silence of people stopping to look, but the silence of people who already knew, who had already arranged their bodies into the careful, peripheral awareness of prey that has clocked a predator and decided the best strategy is stillness. I turned. He was standing in the doorway, and I understood, with the sudden, clarifying certainty of someone who has just put their hand on a live wire, exactly who Margot had meant. He was tall in the way that rearranges a room. Dark hair, swept back. A jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who was making a point. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, the top button of his shirt undone, and the overall effect was of a man who owned the concept of formality and had simply chosen, tonight, to set it down. His eyes moved across the room with the slow, total authority of someone doing an inventory. Not of the guests, of everything. They landed on me. I dropped a bottle of bitters. It didn't break. I caught it on the way down, a reflex, nothing more. But the catch was too fast, too clean. And he had seen it. One corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of something filed away. Then he walked to the private booth at the far end of the bar, and the room exhaled. Margot appeared at my elbow from nowhere. "I told you," she said, very quietly. "Don't draw attention." "I dropped something," I whispered, and caught it. She looked at me with an expression I would later learn to identify as the particular look of someone watching a person walk toward a cliff edge in brand new shoes. There's a difference. His name, I learned in fragments over the next 2 hours, was Dorian Vane. That was the name the other bartenders used in hushed, careful tones when they thought I couldn't hear. The guests called him nothing to his face. The staff called him simply him, the pronoun carrying all the weight of a full title. I learned other things too, that he came in every Thursday, that he always sat in the same booth, that he ordered one drink, an aged red wine that Margot poured herself from a bottle kept separately, and that he never finished it, that no one sat with him unless invited. Tonight, someone had sat with him uninvited. I noticed because the temperature dropped again, this time sharper. The man who had slid into the booth across from Dorian Vane was smiling the specific smile of someone who has rehearsed it for confidence and has not quite achieved it. He was talking. Whatever he was saying, Dorian's face was the surface of a frozen lake, utterly still, utterly impenetrable. Then Dorian looked up from the man across from him, and looked directly at me. I was already moving. Later, I would not be entirely able to explain why, only that some part of me had read the room the way you learn to read rooms in this business, and understood that something was about to go very wrong, and that the only variable in the immediate vicinity that could interrupt it was me. I picked up a cloth and a glass, walked to the booth, and said in my most professionally neutral voice, "I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I refresh anything for you?" The man across from Dorian went very still. Dorian looked at me for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually do. Then he said, his voice low and precise, yes, in fact. He gestured to the seat beside him. "Sit, I'm on shift, I said. My voice did not shake. I was proud of that. You are now on a different kind of shift, he said. And something in the way he said it made the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand at full attention. Sit down, please, and look at me as though you know me. The man across from us was watching me with an expression I did not like at all. I sat. Dorian's hand came to rest on the table, close to mine. Not touching, but close enough that the cold radiating from him was a physical thing, like holding your hand near ice. Good, he said, very quietly, so only I could hear. Now smile, like I have just said something that surprised you pleasantly. I smiled. It was the smile I used when a guest insisted the drink I had just made correctly was wrong, and I had to agree with them while knowing I was right. It was, I had been told, very convincing. The man across the table stood abruptly. Another time, he said, directed at Dorian. There won't be one, Dorian replied. A statement of fact, nothing more. The man left. The booth was very quiet. Thank you, Dorian said, after a moment. You're welcome, I said. Do you want me to go now? He looked at me, the full weight of those dark eyes. No, he said. I want you to tell me your name. Sarah, I said. Sarah Calloway. He repeated it, not as a greeting but as something being catalogued. How long have you worked here, Sarah Calloway? Tonight is my first shift. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, more like the confirmation of a hypothesis. And yet you walked to this booth, he said, with the specific confidence of someone who had assessed the situation and made a strategic decision. I've worked bars for a long time, I said. You learned to read a room. What did you read? I looked at him. I had a rule, a personal one developed through years of working rooms full of powerful people. Never tell a powerful person what you actually think of them the first time you meet. It tends to either flatter or alarm, and both outcomes are inconvenient. But there was something in the way he asked it, direct and without performance. That made the rule feel temporary, that the man sitting across from you wanted something you weren't going to give him, I said, and that it was about to become unpleasant, and that an interruption would resolve it faster than whatever you were about to do. What was I about to do? I don't know, I admitted. But the temperature in the room dropped about 3 degrees when you looked at him. I thought I'd intervene before we got to frost. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't emptiness, but the opposite. A quiet so full of something it has no room for sound. You felt that, he said finally. The temperature? Yes. Most people don't. He studied me with an attention that was different from being looked at. It was more like being read. They noticed the effect, but not the cause. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which turned out to be the right answer. I have a proposition for you, he said. Every nerve in my body issued a small, collective advisory. I had learned through catastrophic personal experience that sentences beginning with "I have a proposition" tended to be the origin point of most of my more memorable disasters. And yet, I'm listening, I said. He leaned back slightly, the way people do when they're about to deliver something they've already decided on, and are now simply arranging the words into the order most likely to be accepted. In 3 days, he said, I am required to attend a formal gathering. A conclave of certain parties, whose cooperation I require for, matters I won't detail. To arrive alone would signal a vulnerability I am not prepared to concede. He paused. I need someone to attend with me as my intended. Your intended, I repeated. My bride, he said, with the precision of a man who finds ambiguity irritating. In appearance only. For the duration of the event and the 2 days of social obligation surrounding it. 7 days in total. I looked at him. You want to hire a fake fiancé. I want to retain, he said, with a faint emphasis on the word. A woman of sufficient composure and perceptiveness to play the role convincingly among guests who will be actively looking for weaknesses in the performance. And you've decided, based on a 3-minute interaction, that I'm that person. I decided, he said, in approximately 45 seconds. The remaining 2.5 minutes were courtesy. I should have said no. Every reasonable fiber of me understood this. I had just arrived in a new city. I had $42. I had no context for who this man was or what his world contained, beyond the evidence currently before me, which included a temperature drop when he entered the room, a clientele that moved like people who had stopped being afraid of the dark because they were the dark, and a proposition delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had never once been told no and found the concept academically interesting at best. I said, "How much?" He named a figure. The glass I was holding did not shatter, which I considered a personal triumph of composure. The number, he said, was enough to cover my mother's remaining medical debt, 3 months of rent on a decent apartment, and a new savings account with enough left over to make Biscuit's absence feel, financially at least, survivable. 7 days. I said. 7 days, he confirmed. You will be given appropriate clothing. A private room in my residence. Your current employment will be placed on hold with full compensation. At the end of the 7 days, you will return to your life, and I will have no further claim on your time. And what exactly does the role require? To appear at my side. To conduct yourself with the confidence of a woman who has chosen me freely and would choose me again. To deflect personal questions with warmth and without information. His eyes held mine, and to trust that whatever you observe in the next 7 days remains between us. I thought about the man who had been sitting across from him an hour ago, the rehearsed smile, the table's sudden stillness when I sat down. The man you sent away, I said. He was a problem. He was a message, Dorian said, from people who were watching for signs that I am isolated. A man who attends this conclave alone, in my world, is a man who has lost alliances. They will interpret it as weakness and move accordingly. And a man who attends with someone convincing is a man who is chosen carefully, he said, which sends a different message entirely. I looked around the bar. Margot was watching us from the far end, with an expression that was either professional neutrality or concealed alarm. I couldn't tell which. The other staff had developed a sudden and thorough interest in their respective tasks. I need to know one thing, I said. Ask the people at this conclave. Are they dangerous? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. To most people, he said. Yes, to me specifically. If I'm with you? Not if you do exactly as I say. And if I don't? Then we'll both have a problem, he said, and something in his voice was not a threat, but a precise statement of observable fact, which was somehow more alarming. But I don't anticipate that. You read a room in 45 seconds and made a decision that most people with a decade of experience in my world wouldn't have made. You'll do fine. I exhaled. It came out steadier than I expected. 7 days, I said. And at the end of it, I walk away clean. You have my word, he said. I had no particular reason to believe the word of a stranger who had just hired me to be his fake fiancé in a bar that existed slightly outside normal physics. But the room was quiet. His voice had been consistent, and the specific, practiced intuition of someone who has spent years reading the difference between people being honest and people performing honesty told me, with a clarity that surprised me, that he meant it. Okay, I said. He extended his hand. It was cold. I shook it. My car will collect you tomorrow at 8, he said. Pack light. Everything you need will be provided. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the dark panel at the back of the bar. The room temperature rose, in increments, back to normal. I sat in the booth for a moment longer than I needed to, looking at the untouched wine glass he had left behind, and thought about the $42 in my pocket and the particular sequence of choices that had led me to this precise moment. Then, Margot appeared. "What?" she said carefully. "Did he say to you?" "He offered me a job," I said. She looked at me for a long moment, with the expression I would later learn was not concealed alarm after all, but something closer to recognition. "Of course he did," she said, quietly, and walked away. His car arrived at 7:58 the next morning, which told me something about him before I had even climbed inside. It was a black car, long and silent, with the particular quality of expensive vehicles that seem to generate their own gravitational field. The driver was a woman, which surprised me, compact and watchful, with dark eyes that conducted a thorough assessment of me and my single rolling suitcase in approximately the time it takes to blink. "Miss Calloway," she said. "Not a question." "That's me." She took my suitcase without being asked, placed it in the trunk with a care that suggested she had opinions about luggage, and held the rear door open. Inside, the car smelled like cedar and something older, something that belonged to stone corridors and candlelight. There was a card on the seat. Heavy paper, no envelope, my name written on it in handwriting that moved across the page like it had somewhere important to be. I opened it. "There will be a fitting this morning. Wear what they suggest. The role requires it. Breakfast has been arranged." The D was not a flourish. It was a fact. The car moved through the early city with the ease of something that knows where it's going and has never once been unsure of its right to go there. I watched New Orleans slide past the tinted window, the wrought iron and the magnolias, and the particular morning light that exists only in cities built on water. Everything slightly liquid, slightly dreamed. We pulled through iron gates I recognized from the previous night, though in daylight they looked different. Less forbidding, more like a declaration. The property beyond them was a house in the way that a cathedral is a building. Technically accurate, fundamentally insufficient. It sat behind a wall of mature oaks, 3 stories of pale stone and dark shutters, with galleries running the width of each floor and window glass that caught the morning light and held it. I was shown inside by a man named Laurent, who had the specific energy of a person who has been employed by the same household long enough to have absorbed its priorities entirely. He led me to a room on the 2nd floor that was not a guest room in any hotel sense. It was the size of my entire Chicago apartment, furnished with the confidence of someone who had chosen everything for longevity rather than trend. The bed had 4 posts in white linen. The windows looked over a garden that was formal without being cold. On a rack near the window were clothes. I walked over. Dresses, in deep blues and wine reds and soft creams. A structured jacket in charcoal. Evening wear that made the most expensive thing I'd ever owned look like a conversation piece. Everything on the rack had the weight of quality that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. A woman came in, around 60, with silver hair and measuring tape looped around her neck like a talisman. She introduced herself as Heloise and looked at me the way architects look at a site, with professional interest and no personal opinion. "Try the blue," she said, pointing. "The silk one. Not the navy. The one with the French seam." I did. Heloise walked around me 3 times, made adjustments I couldn't feel but apparently mattered, and said, "You carry yourself well." "Do you know that?" "I've been told I have good posture," I said. "That's not what I mean." She pinned something at my shoulder. "You know where your body is in a room. Most people don't. They're always slightly surprised by the space they take up." She stepped back. "He chose well. He chose fast," I said. He'd known me about 45 seconds. Heloise smiled. It was the smile of someone who was not surprised. "He always knows fast," she said. It's been 40 years since I've seen him wrong. I had many questions about that sentence. I asked none of them. Breakfast was laid in a sunroom off the back of the house, where the garden light came in through glass and made everything warmer than the stone walls suggested was possible. I ate alone, which I had expected. What I hadn't expected was that the food was exactly right. Eggs prepared in the specific way I preferred without having been asked, coffee strong enough to mean something, fruit that was ripe rather than decorative. I was on my second cup when he walked in. In daylight, Dorian Vane was different and exactly the same. The suit was gone, replaced by dark trousers and a shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked less like a painting and more like a person, which was almost more unsettling because it closed some of the distance I had been using as perspective. He sat across from me without preamble and poured himself coffee that he would not drink. I would learn this later, that the coffee was a social gesture, a bridge between his world and whoever he was sitting with. "The fitting went well?" he asked. "Heloise is precise," I said. "She is." He looked out at the garden briefly. "I need to explain what you'll be walking into." "That would be helpful," I said. He set the cup down. "The people who will be at this conclave are not people in the conventional sense. They are what I am, creatures of significant age, significant power, and significant interest in the dynamics of those around them. They will be watching you." "For what?" "For cracks," he said. "A performance is only as good as its weakest moment. If you hesitate when someone asks how we met, if you flinch when I touch your hand, if your smile doesn't reach your eyes, they'll know, and they'll use it. What will they do with it?" His eyes met mine. The conclave exists because open conflict is expensive and visible, so the warfare is social. Information is currency. A weakness in me, a doubt about my stability or my alliances, becomes a commodity they can trade. He paused. "You being here makes me look stronger. You being obviously fake makes me look desperate. Which is worse. So I need to be convincing," I said. "You need to be real," he said, with a precision that split the two things clearly. "Not an act. Real. The best lies always are." I thought about that. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked, managing all of it, the politics, the warfare. He looked at me for a moment, long enough that the question no longer means what it used to. It was the most honest deflection I had ever heard. "We'll practice," he said, standing, "tonight and tomorrow. How we move together, what we say, what we don't say." He looked down at me. "You are not afraid of me." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't entirely an observation either. It was something between the two, something he seemed to be testing the weight of. "Should I be?" I asked. "Most people are," he said. "I've worked bars for 12 years, I said. "I've been afraid of people. I know what it feels like." "You don't make me feel that way." Something in his expression shifted, so slightly that I almost missed it. A fractional softening, like the moment before ice begins to change. He said, "Good," and walked out of the sunroom. I sat with my coffee and looked at the garden and tried to identify what I was feeling. Not fear, as stated. Not entirely comfort, either. Something in between. The particular alertness of standing on ground that is solid but new, where each step requires attention, not because it's dangerous, but because nothing is yet familiar. 7 days, I told myself. And then home. What I did not know, sitting in that sunroom, with the garden light on my hands, and the good coffee going cool in its cup, was that, by day 3, home would have started to feel like a word in a language I used to speak. Day 1 passed in preparation. We practiced in the library, which was a room that should not have existed in any residential building, and yet existed here with the casual confidence of something that had never considered being elsewhere. The shelves ran from floor to ceiling on 3 walls. filled with volumes that had the worn solidity of books that had been read rather than displayed. A fireplace at one end burned low, even in the Louisiana heat, because the house, I was beginning to understand, operated at Dorian's temperature rather than the climate's. He was a precise instructor. We practiced the way we walked together, his hand at the small of my back, which was cold through the fabric of my dress and yet not unpleasant, a grounding sensation, the way a cold surface on a warm day clarifies your sense of where you are. He showed me the difference between the touch of a man performing partnership and the touch of a man who has a right to it, the latter being less demonstrative and more certain. A hand that doesn't display, but simply is. When someone asks you how we met, he said, "What do you say? What do you want me to say?" "Whatever you would say," he replied, "if it were true." I thought for a moment. "I'd say I was working," I said, "that you came in on a busy night and something about the room changed when you walked in, that you asked me to sit with you and I said yes before I understood why." He looked at me. "That's real," I said. "Everything about that is actually what happened." "Yes," he said quietly. "It is. We ate dinner in a dining room that was too large for two people and felt it. Laurent served in silence and with precision. Dorian did not eat, which I had expected on some level I couldn't name. He sat with a glass of wine and watched me eat without the self-consciousness that watching usually generates. "Do you know what I am?" he asked. The question came between my second and third course, placed into the quiet of the room with the same directness he used for everything. I looked up. "I have a working theory," I said. "What is it?" "That the world contains more than I was taught to account for," I said, "and that you're one of those things." "Does that trouble you?" I considered the question honestly. "No," I said. "It explains the temperature." He almost smiled. It was the second time I had seen the corner of his mouth do that specific thing, not amusement exactly, but its antechamber. "You have a singular way of approaching unusual information," he said. "I grew up with a grandmother who saw things other people didn't," I said. "She said the world was wider than most people were comfortable with. I believed her then. I believe you now." "Wise woman," he said. "She would have had something to say about this situation," I said. "I'm not sure what, but it would have been accurate and uncomfortable." "Grandmothers usually are," he said, and something in his voice held a weight that suggested a relationship with the concept of grandmothers that spanned longer than it should have. That night, in the room with the four-poster bed and the white linen, I lay awake and listened to the house. Old houses have sounds, not creaks and groans, but conversations. The language of settling stone and shifting wood and air, moving through spaces designed for different eras. This house spoke slowly. It was not a worried house. It was a house that had seen enough to have stopped being surprised. Somewhere below, I heard him moving. A single set of footsteps, unhurried, in a room I couldn't identify. And then, silence. Day 2 was rain. It came in the way New Orleans rain comes, total and warm, as if the sky had made a commitment and intended to honor it. The garden outside my window disappeared into soft gray. The house smelled of old wood, and the particular indoor quality of a place buttoned against weather, close and warm, and strangely safe. We spent the morning going through the guest list for the conclave. Dorian sat across the desk from me with a leather-bound ledger and went through each name with the specificity of someone briefing a diplomat. "Elspeth Ruin," he said. "Elder, 3 centuries. She will test you by asking you questions about me that I supposedly should have told you. Answer them as though you know more than she thinks you do, but reveal nothing." "How?" "Ask her something in return," he said. "Elders hate being questioned. She'll redirect." "Celeste Morn," he continued. "Younger 2 decades. She'll be warm and interested, and every word will be currency she's saving. Say very little. Smile a great deal. People like Celeste mistake warmth for alliance. And what about the one you're most worried about? I said. He stopped. You've listed 12 people, I said. You've given me calibrated instructions for each one, but you described them all with the same level of detail, except you haven't mentioned the one who's actually the problem. People do that. They talk around the thing they're most concerned about. He set the ledger down. His name is Raval, he said. He is very old and very patient, and he has wanted what I have for longer than most of the guest list has been alive. He met my eyes. He will be looking for proof that my position has weakened. You are the counter-argument. Me specifically, I said. A man who chooses well, he said, repeating the words from our first night, sends a message. And what does it say about you, I asked, that you chose a human bartender you'd known for 45 seconds? He was quiet for a moment. It says, he said carefully, that I trust my instincts, which I have not doubted for a very long time. The afternoon was quieter. I found myself in the library with a book I'd taken from the shelves, something mid-century and half in French, and I read it without understanding everything, and was content with that. He came in around 4, sat in the chair nearest the fire, and opened something of his own. We did not speak for 2 hours. It was the most comfortable silence I had experienced in a long time, the kind that doesn't require management, that simply exists between two people who have, without discussing it, decided that presence is enough. At 6, he looked up. You read with your whole face, he said. What? When something interests you, he said, your expression changes. Completely. He said it as though he had been watching, and wasn't self-conscious about having done so. Is that a problem? I asked. No, he said. It's the opposite. He looked back at his book. It's been a long time since someone in this house read for pleasure. I looked at him. At the line of his jaw in the firelight. At the way he held the book, like something he'd held 1,000 times. At the slight furrow between his brows that was concentration, not displeasure. I turned back to my book. 7 days, I reminded myself. But the voice that said it was already quieter than it had been the day before. Day 3 began like the others. It did not end that way. I woke early, before the house stirred, and went down to the sunroom with the particular hunger of someone who has slept well in an unfamiliar place and is surprised to find themselves rested. The garden was still wet from yesterday's rain. The light was the thin golden kind that comes before the city fully wakes, before noise has reasserted itself, when the world is briefly content to simply exist. Laurent appeared with coffee, and the quiet efficiency I had come to find deeply reassuring. I sat with it and watched a bird I didn't recognize pick its way across the wet stone of the garden path. I heard him before I saw him, not footsteps. I had learned by now that he didn't produce footsteps the way people do, each step a small announcement. He moved the way weather moves, present before you register the shift. But I heard something, a door, a breath of displaced air, and then he was in the doorway of the sunroom. Not in dark trousers and a shirt this time, but in what looked like clothes he'd been in all night. His hair was less ordered. There was a tension in his jaw that was different from his usual precision. You're up early, I said. I didn't sleep, he said. Do you? I asked, and then caught myself. Sorry, I don't know how that works. Sometimes, he said, coming in and sitting, not at the far end of the table, but in the chair closer to mine, when there's something worth waking for. He poured coffee. Set it down without drinking. Revel sent a message this morning, he said. What kind? The social kind. His jaw tightened. He has heard, through channels I have not yet identified, that I am attending the conclave with someone. He sent his congratulations. The word arrived in the room with a temperature of its own. It was not congratulations. It was a warning, I said. It was a probe, he corrected. He is trying to determine if you are real. If this is real. He looked at me, and for the first time there was something in his eyes that was not the calibrated composure of the previous days. Something raw. If he determines it isn't, the conclave becomes significantly more dangerous. Then we need to be more convincing, I said. Yes, he held my gaze. Which is what I need to discuss with you. I waited. The performance so far, he said, has been practiced. Correct. Technically sufficient. He was choosing words with unusual care, like a man crossing ice. What Revel will be looking for is not technique. He has been alive long enough to recognize a polished surface. He will be looking for the imperfections, the specific, unrepeatable evidence of two people who have actually chosen each other. What kind of evidence? I said. The way you look at me when I'm not looking at you, he said quietly. The way I reach for you before I've thought about it. The conversation that happens under the conversation. He met my eyes. Those things cannot be practiced. They either exist or they don't. The sunroom was very quiet. And you're telling me this, I said carefully, because you think they don't? He was still for a moment, and then he said, I'm telling you this because I think they might. I had not expected that sentence. I had no prepared response for it. I sat with it in the way you sit with something that has reordered the furniture of a room you thought you knew. Dorian, I said. This is not a renegotiation, he said quickly, and I recognized it as the tone of a person heading off their own mistake. The terms are what they were. 7 days. You walk away. He looked out at the garden. I am simply being honest with you, because you seem to respond better to honesty than to strategy. That's accurate, I said. I have not brought anyone here in a very long time, he said. Not to this house. Not to this role. He picked up the coffee cup and set it down again without drinking. And when I sat across from you in that booth and you looked at the room the way you did, I did not make a strategic calculation. I made an instinctive one. And those are different things. I looked at him, at the tiredness around his eyes that was not the tiredness of a missed night, but something older, the tiredness of someone who has been in a kind of vigilance for so long, it had become structural. When did you last trust someone? I asked. He thought about it, which told me the answer was not recent. Long enough ago that the memory of it is more concept than experience, he said. That sounds exhausting, I said. Not with pity, simply with accuracy. It is, he said, and the admission was so clean, so undefended, that it did something to the shape of the space between us. We sat in the morning light for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, in a different voice, lighter and deliberate, as if choosing to resurface, the conclave is tomorrow night. Today I thought you might want to see the city. The city? I looked up. You arrived 3 days ago and have not left this house, he said. You traded one unfamiliar room for another. That's not how you settle into a place. You want to take me out, I said. I want to walk through the quarter with you, he said. In daylight. As two people who might conceivably have chosen each other. He held my gaze. And because you have been very patient with a situation that required a significant amount of trust, and I find that I want to do something that is less about strategy and more about that. I looked at him for a moment, at the precision of his face in the morning light, at the coffee he never drank. Give me 20 minutes, I said. He nodded. I went upstairs and changed into the charcoal jacket Hello Eyes had pinned on me and a pair of dark trousers that fit like they'd been made for exactly this day. I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment, not checking the performance, but simply registering the person. We walked out of the iron gates at 8:30. He did not take my hand immediately. We walked a half block apart in the way of two people who are aware of each other without making it a statement. The city was waking up around us, coffee shops pulling back their shutters, the smell of beignets and wet stone and river air moving through the streets. Then, he said something about the building on the corner, the history of it, a detail that was specific and unexpected, and I turned to look at it, and when I turned back he had closed a distance without announcing it. His arm was near mine. His pace matched mine. We walked like that for an hour. Through the quarter and down toward the river, and back through streets I didn't know the names of yet, but was beginning to want to. He knew the city the way people know things they have loved for a long time, without needing to say so. He pointed out things without performing the pointing. He asked me questions and listened to the answers in a way that meant he was actually storing them. At some point I realized his hand was at the small of my back. Not staged. Not practiced. Simply there, and I realized, walking through the waking city with the morning light on the old buildings and his cold hand a steady weight at my back, that I had stopped counting the days. The conclave was held in a building that the city didn't know existed. That was not metaphor. The address, when Dorian had shown it to me on a hand-drawn map rather than a phone, corresponded to what any map would show as a decommissioned textile warehouse on the edge of the Marigny. The exterior was appropriately derelict, convincingly abandoned, the kind of building a city stops asking questions about. The interior was another matter entirely. We arrived in the black car, Laurent driving with her particular focused silence. I was in the midnight blue dress Heloise had fitted, and it moved the way good fabric moves, with intention. Dorian had given me a necklace before we left, a single dark stone on a fine chain that sat at my collarbone, with the weight of something chosen, not borrowed. His fingers had been cold at my neck when he fastened it, and he had not stepped back immediately after, and neither had I. Now, in the car, he looked at me. "How are you feeling?" Like someone who is walking into a room full of people who are very old and very good at noticing things, I said. Accurate, he considered me. "You'll be fine. Tell me what fine looks like in this context. You leave with the same number of secrets you came in with," he said, and then, with something that might have been warmth, and with me. The doors of the warehouse opened as we approached, which was the first of several things that evening that technically should not have been possible, and simply was. Inside, the space had been transformed, a high, vaulted interior lit by chandeliers that belonged in a different century, draped in fabrics that moved even where there was no air current. The floor was dark stone. The music was live, and came from somewhere I couldn't locate. The guests were already assembled. I had prepared for this. I had gone through every name on that ledger, absorbed every piece of contextual information Dorian had given me, rehearsed my face into something that could receive all of it without reacting. But preparation and arrival are different countries, and the moment we stepped through those doors, I understood viscerally what he had meant about a symphony of deception. The room was a performance. Every person in it was performing, and every person in it was watching the performances around them with the trained attention of those who have had centuries to perfect the art of reading the unspoken. They turned when we entered. Not obviously, not all at once, but I felt it, the collective reorientation of attention, subtle as a shift in atmospheric pressure. Dorian's hand was at my back. Certain, there, we moved into the room as though we belonged, which is different from moving into a room as though you are allowed to be there. The second is permission. The first is ownership. He had tried to explain this distinction in the library, and I had understood it intellectually. Now I felt it in my spine. The first person to approach was a woman in gold who introduced herself as Elspeth. She was, as Dorian had said, 3 centuries old, and it was apparent in the way that age is sometimes apparent in people who carry it differently from how we expect. Not in the face, but in the pace, in the quality of attention. She looked at me the way antique appraisers look at objects, for authenticity markers invisible to untrained eyes. "So," she said, her voice warm and curious and pointing, "this is who finally managed it." "Managed what?" I asked. She smiled. "His attention." "I didn't manage anything," I said. "He made up his own mind." "They tend to," I added, glancing at Dorian with the particular ease of someone who has had this thought before and is comfortable sharing it, when no one's performing for them. Elspeth looked at me for a moment longer than she'd intended to. Then she laughed, genuine and brief, and moved on. Dorian's hand pressed once, lightly, at my back. "Good." Celeste Morn found us near the edge of the room, beautiful and warm as a fire you can't trust. She asked me thoughtful questions and listened to my answers with the bright interest of someone collecting materials. I gave her warmth and brevity and 2 questions for every one of hers, which redirected her energy so smoothly she seemed to enjoy it. When she moved away, Dorian leaned slightly toward me. "You were right about her," he said quietly. "Warmth as currency. It's a common one," I said. "Easy to counterfeit." "Unlike yours," he said. And he said it simply as a fact without the weight of compliment, which meant more. We moved through the room. I kept my awareness on 2 things simultaneously: the social choreography of the space and Dorian, not as performance, but as instinct. I had been around him long enough now that I could read his micro-adjustments, the slight shift when someone approached he found politically complex, the almost imperceptible stillness when something in a conversation required management. I responded to these without discussing them, filling the space, redirecting, providing the specific warmth that his temperature didn't. It was the strangest thing I had ever done with my body. It was also, I realized, not entirely unlike bartending. Reading the room. Responding before being asked. Knowing what was needed and providing it without making the provision visible. The skills were not identical. They were cousins. Then, I saw him. Revel. He was tall, silver-haired, with the ageless face that belonged to everything in this room, but on him it sat differently, more settled, as though time had not just moved through him, but had come to some arrangement with him about the terms. He was watching us from across the room with a stillness that was not passive, but active, the stillness of something calculating. Dorian felt me tense and looked down. "Revel," I said, so quietly only he could hear. "I see him," he said. "He's been watching us for 10 minutes. "I know." "What does he see?" I asked. "That," Dorian said, "is what we're about to find out." Revel moved toward us slowly, with the patience of a man for whom the word urgency had lost all personal relevance. He was smiling. It was not a warm smile, but it was a real one, which in this room was almost more alarming than warmth would have been. "Dorian," he said, a greeting that was also an assessment. Revel, equal and opposite. Revel's eyes moved to me. He said nothing at first. Simply looked, with the full, unhurried weight of his attention. I held it without flinching, and without performing stillness, just existed in my own space, one hand resting loosely in the crook of Dorian's arm, my face arranged in the particular expression of a woman who is curious about the person she's meeting, but not unsettled by them. "You chose well," Reval said finally. The same words Heloise had used, but in his mouth they carried a different inflection, one that acknowledged something he had not expected to acknowledge. "I did," Dorian said. Revel looked between us, and I watched him do the specific calculation of someone searching for the seam, the line where performance met reality, and finding, in his expression's small revision, that he couldn't locate it, because there wasn't one. Not anymore. That was the moment I understood something that changed the shape of the next 14 hours. Day 3 had already ended somewhere between the morning sunroom and the walk through the quarter and the cold hand at my back on a street whose name I was learning to want to know. The terms of the arrangement had not changed. 7 days. Days. Walk away clean, but Dorian had said it himself. Terms and truth are different things. And the truth was standing in a chandeliered room in a dress that fit like armor, with a vampire king's arm solid under her hand. And for the first time in 3 years, she was not looking for an exit. After Rival moved away, something shifted in the room. Not obviously. Not in any way that the assembled elders and their attendants would have categorized as an event. But I felt it, the specific atmospheric change of a test that has been quietly graded and quietly returned. The quality of attention on us changed. Before, it had been the attention of an audience watching a performance and withholding judgment. Now, it was something else, something closer to acceptance, if acceptance in this context could be understood to mean we have looked for the weakness and have not found it in the place we expected. It was not warmth. This was not a warm room. But it was, in its particular ancient and unsentimental way, a kind of acknowledgement. Dorian felt it too. I knew because the hand at my back changed quality slightly, from the deliberate pressure of a man maintaining a position to something marginally less constructed. An exhale in the architecture of his posture. We stayed for 3 hours, long enough to complete the necessary circulation, the conversations with the right people in the right sequence, the careful balance of presence and restraint that Dorian had described to me as the grammar of these events. I said the right things, and the right amount of them. I listened more than I spoke. I kept my hand in the crook of his arm and my attention on the room, and at some point in the second hour, I stopped monitoring myself doing it. The night ended without incident, which Dorian told me on the drive home was itself a form of victory. No one moved against you, I said. No one tried to, he said, which means they believe what they saw. What did they see? He looked at me in the dark of the car. Someone real, he said. I looked out the window at the city moving past. Day 3, I said. Not quite to him, more as an observation placed into the air between us. Day 3, he agreed quietly. The house was still when we returned. Laurent had left a lamp burning in the entrance hall and something warm covered on the kitchen table for me, because she had noticed, without being told to, that I ate at midnight when I'd been on my feet for hours. I stood in the kitchen eating soup that was excellent and looking at the dark garden through the window, still in the midnight blue dress, my heels set beside the table. I heard him in the doorway. You should sleep, he said. I will, I said. In a minute. He came in and sat at the far end of the kitchen table, not beside me. A respectful distance. The kitchen was warmer than the rest of the house, the only room that consistently resisted the ambient temperature he generated. You were extraordinary tonight, he said. Not a compliment in the social sense, a report. I was doing what we practiced, I said. No, he said. You stopped doing what we practiced somewhere around the second hour. What you were doing after that was something else. I looked at him. What was it? Being there, he said simply. The kitchen was quiet. Dorian, I said. Yes, when the 7 days are up, I said, and I was choosing words with care that surprised me, and I go back. What does that look like? Practically, he was quiet for a moment. Laurent returns you to the city. Your position at the Midnight Lace will be yours if you want it. Everything is as it was. Everything? I said. He held my gaze, as close as possible. I looked down at the soup bowl. That's a different answer from yes, I said. Yes, he said. Which part isn't possible? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the table, at his hands, at some middle distance that held more than I could access. Then he said, "Memory doesn't reset." I sat with that. "No," I said, "it doesn't." We were quiet for a long moment, the kind that has weight and texture, that isn't the absence of conversation but a conversation of a different register. Then I said, "Can I ask you something that isn't about the conclave or Rival or any of it?" "Yes, what do you want?" I said. Not strategically, not politically, just, what do you actually want? He looked at me for a long time, long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, in the quiet, undefended voice he'd used in the sunroom that morning, "I want a room that isn't quiet, because it's empty." I understood that with my whole chest. "I want someone," he continued, slower now, feeling the words as he said them, "who reads with their whole face and asks the question underneath the question and doesn't flinch at the temperature." He paused. I have wanted that for a very long time, and I had stopped expecting to find it. The lamp in the hall sent its light in a long rectangle across the kitchen floor. Somewhere outside, the city made its soft nocturnal sounds. I stood up and brought my bowl to the sink. I stood there for a moment with the water running, not doing anything with it. Then, I turned around. He was still at the table, watching me with the careful attention of someone who is not permitting themselves to hope, but has not entirely succeeded. I walked back to the table, not to my chair, to his end. I stopped beside him, close enough that the cold of him was a presence, the way cold objects in warm rooms generate their own zone of altered air. He looked up at me, and in his eyes there was something I recognized from the study of human faces across 1,000 bar tops: vulnerability, held very still, afraid of moving in case it breaks. I put my hand on his jaw. He went absolutely motionless. His skin was cold, and the bone beneath it was solid, and the muscles of his jaw were pulled tight with the effort of not reacting. I felt his breath, slow and deliberate. "Day 3, I said softly. "And you stopped pretending." "I stopped," he said, his voice careful as glass, "before I noticed I had." "So did I said. He reached up and put his hand over mine, his cold fingers covering my warmer ones, not moving my hand away, keeping it there. A man who has wanted a warm thing and found one, and is holding it with the specific carefulness of someone who understands that warmth is not indestructible. "Sira," he said. "I know," I said. "4 more days," he said. "And then you, I know," I said again. Softer, we stayed like that for a moment, my hand on his jaw, his hand over mine, the warm kitchen around us, and the cool house beyond it, and the city outside that didn't know or care that in this room something true was being very carefully held. Then I leaned down and pressed my forehead to his. His eyes closed. 4 more days, I said. "Let's not waste them deciding what happens after." He exhaled. It was the first time I had heard him exhale without composure managing it. "No," he said. "Let's not." Day 4 arrived with a different quality of light. I noticed it from the bed, the way the morning came through the shutters, at an angle that meant the season was tilting, barely, 1 degree towards something warmer. New Orleans light in late spring has a specific generosity to it, a willingness to stay. I lay still for a few minutes and thought about what had happened in the kitchen, and what it meant, and whether thinking carefully about it would help, or whether it was the kind of thing that thinking carefully about only makes smaller than it actually is. I decided the latter and got up. He was in the library when I found him, which was where I had started to understand he spent his non-sleeping hours. The ones he didn't spend in the study or the sunroom or standing in that room I still couldn't identify, doing the things that ancient and powerful people do in the hours when the rest of the world is unconscious. He had a map spread on the reading table, hand-drawn and old, covered in annotations, in at least 3 different handwritings across what appeared to be several centuries. He looked up when I came in. "Breakfast is in the sunroom," he said. "I know." I sat in the chair across from the reading table. "What are you looking at?" He turned the map so I could see it. "Properties," he said. "I have been considering whether to reduce them." "Why?" "Because the conclave revealed something I hadn't fully quantified," he said. "The span of what I maintain has made me, in certain ways, visible. Raval's interest is partly territorial." He traced a line on the map. "Holding less sometimes means being stronger." "That's a very counterintuitive kind of power," I said. "Most real power is," he said. He looked at me. "You sleep well?" "I did," I said. "You?" "Better than usual," he said, with the careful honesty he had been deploying more consistently since day 3. I looked at the map, at the span of it, at the annotations in different hands across different centuries, the record of a life that exceeded any architecture I had for imagining it. "Can I ask you something else?" I said. "You ask me more questions than anyone has in a very long time," he said, not as a complaint. "And you answer them," I said. "Yes," he said, "I do." "Has it always been like this? The conclave, the politics, the management of everyone around you?" He leaned back in his chair. "Not always," he said. "There was a period, earlier, when the world was different enough that these things were less formal, less like chess." He looked at the map. "It becomes chess when the stakes are high enough for long enough, when enough people have tried enough things. The game codifies." He glanced at me. "I preferred the earlier version. What was the earlier version like?" He was quiet for a moment, and I watched him do the specific thing he did when accessing memory that was old, the slight unfocusing of his eyes, the sense of him going somewhere that was not this room. "Louder," he said finally. "Less careful. More dangerous in certain ways, and less dangerous in others." A pause. "More honest." "And now?" "Now," he said. "I have not answered a question honestly in a social context in so long that last night I was aware of doing it as an event." "What question?" Raval asked me, he said, how long we had been together. I looked at him. "What did you say?" "The truth," he said. I said it felt like longer than it was. Which is the truest thing I have said to another person in a very long time. The library was very quiet. "Does that frighten you?" I asked. "Being honest, it frightens me," he said, "the way heights frighten people who are not afraid of falling, but are aware that the ground has specific opinions about velocity." He met my eyes. "The height itself is not the fear. It's knowing what the fall would cost." I understood that. Not from the same position, not from centuries of careful self-management and political survival, but from the more ordinary version, from all the regular human ways of learning that openness is expensive. We ate breakfast together in the sunroom, and afterward he showed me the rest of the house. Not the formal rooms I'd already seen, but the other parts, the ones that were less architecture and more time made physical. A room on the 3rd floor, with walls lined in framed maps and navigational instruments from eras before GPS or satellite made such instruments obsolete. A cellar beneath the garden that was not a wine cellar but a kind of archive. Shelves of bound documents and correspondence from centuries of accumulated relationship and history. A small room off the kitchen that was just a room, plain and warm, with a single chair by the window and a low table, everything worn with use. "What's this one for?" I asked. "Reading," he said simply, "when the library is too large." I looked at the chair, at the worn armrests, the particular compression of the cushion. "You spend a lot of time in here," I said. "I have for a very long time," he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it, standing in the doorway of that plain small room, that was different from all his other careful honesty. Something that acknowledged, without specifically naming, The particular wait of very long time spent alone in small rooms by choice, because the alternative was worse. I stepped past him into the room and sat in the chair. It was comfortable in a way that expensive chairs frequently weren't, the comfort of something shaped to a specific person over time. I looked up at him. He was standing in the doorway, watching me sit in his chair, in his quiet room, with an expression on his face that I had no word for yet. But I recognized the shape of it. It was the shape of someone watching something ordinary happen in a space they had stopped expecting ordinary things in. "I like this room," I said. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I showed it to you." In the afternoon, we walked again, a different route, deeper into the city, away from the tourist geography of the quarter and into the neighborhoods that were more daily, more lived. He knew these streets the way people know places they have returned to consistently over time, with the relaxed familiarity of someone who has watched a place change and stayed while it did. He bought me coffee from a place that existed in a converted house with a courtyard, 3 tables, and excellent espresso, the kind of establishment that had never advertised and never needed to. We sat in the courtyard, and I watched him sit in sunlight, which he did with no particular event, the mythology aside, and he watched the courtyard with the unhurried attention he gave to everything. "Tell me something about you," he said, "that you haven't told me yet." "What kind of something?" "A true one," he said. "Not strategic, not contextual." I thought about it. "I used to draw," I said, "when I was younger. Architectural drawings, buildings, not fine art, just structural things, plans, elevations. I was good at it." "What happened to it?" "I stopped when it stopped feeling like mine," I said. "It started feeling like something I was supposed to be good at rather than something I actually was." I wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. I never found the equivalent again. Something that was just mine and didn't have expectations attached. He looked at me carefully. "Bartending," he said. "Is that it for you?" "Bartending is something I'm good at that doesn't require me to be anything other than competent," I said. "That's different. What would require you to be something more than competent?" I looked at him across the small courtyard table, in the afternoon sunlight that New Orleans offered with such particular generosity, and said honestly, "I don't know yet." He held my gaze. "No," he said quietly. "Neither do I. It was not about bartending. We both knew it wasn't about bartending. Days 5 and 6 moved the way good things move, too quickly to be fully experienced in real time, understood better in retrospect. On day 5 it rained again, a warm, total rain, and we stayed in. He taught me chess, which I had always known the mechanics of and never understood the philosophy of, and he was a patient teacher in the specific way of people who have had centuries to separate what matters in instruction from what is merely habit. He explained it not in terms of pieces and rules, but in terms of commitment. The understanding that every move forecloses other moves, and that accepting this rather than resisting it is the beginning of actual play. I beat him in the 4th game, barely, and he said nothing to indicate he had allowed it, and I could not with certainty say he hadn't, but his expression in the moment of it was the expression of someone who has been surprised by a clean move they hadn't anticipated, and I chose to believe that. In the evening we sat in the small warm room off the kitchen, the plain one with the worn chair, and he read and I read, and the rain did what rain does in old houses, which has become the sound of a room being more fully itself. At some point he said, without looking up from his book, "You hum when you read something you like." "I don't," I said. "You do," he said, with the unshakable calm of someone reporting observable fact. Quietly, just barely. Like a frequency. I was quiet for a moment. "Does it bother you?" I asked. "No," he said, and went back to his book. On day 6, a message came that was not like Rival's message. It came through channels I didn't fully understand, delivered to Dorian in the form of a sealed letter that Lauren brought in during breakfast, with an expression that was not her usual professional quiet. He read it and set it down. "What is it?" I asked. "A formality," he said, which was not an answer. He looked at me. "Do you trust me?" "Yes," I said. The word arrived before I had finished deciding to say it, which was its own answer. He folded the letter and put it in his jacket pocket. "There is a meeting I need to attend this afternoon," he said. "Without you. It relates to the conclave and what was begun there." He looked at me steadily. "I need you to stay here. And if something goes wrong?" I said. "Balthazar will be in the house," he said. "Nothing will go wrong." He paused. "But if it did, stay in the small room, the one that's warm." He said it as if the instruction was practical, as if the room's warmth were the relevant variable. I understood that it wasn't. He left at 2 in the afternoon. I listened to the car pull away through the iron gates. The house was enormous and quiet, and I had existed in quiet houses before without difficulty. But this specific quiet had a quality I wasn't familiar with. The quality of a space that had adjusted itself around a presence that was now temporarily absent. I went to the small warm room and sat in the worn chair and thought about what this was, what it had become. I was a practical person. I had always been a practical person, the kind who could assess a situation with some objectivity, who could separate what was real from what was the manufacture of circumstance and proximity. I assessed. Circumstance, I had been brought into an unfamiliar situation under terms that were explicitly temporary. Proximity, I had spent 6 days in close contact with a person under conditions designed to simulate intimacy. These were the factors. And they were real and they mattered, and they were also not the whole of it, which was the thing I kept returning to. Because circumstances and proximity could generate feeling without meaning, and I knew this, had learned it the hard way in the ordinary human manner. But they didn't generate the specific thing that happened in the kitchen on the 3rd night, when he had said the thing about a room that wasn't quiet because it was empty, and I had recognized it from the inside. They didn't generate the chess game or the small room or the way he said my name when he was not performing anything, when he was simply in the room with me and needed to address me and used my name the way people use names when they have thought about them. He came back at 6. I heard the car and came out of the small room and met him in the entrance hall. He looked the same as when he'd left. Same composure, same measured quality of movement. But something in his eyes was different, a particular kind of resolution that follows difficult decisions made and enacted. "It's handled," he said. "What was it?" He looked at me for a moment. "Raval has withdrawn his interest," he said. "He communicated it through the appropriate channels this afternoon. What he saw at the conclave." He paused. He said it was convincing. "Good," I said. He said specifically, Dorian continued, with the careful tone of someone delivering something he has been deciding how to deliver, that he has not seen that quality of genuine alliance in this city in 60 years, and that he had no interest in opposing it. I was quiet. "Genuine," I said. "His word," Dorian said. We stood in the entrance hall, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and the word genuine sat between us in the particular way that true things do when they have been named by someone who had no interest in being kind. "One more day," I said. "Yes," he said. Dorian, Sarah, the entrance hall was very still. The lamp was on. Somewhere in the house, Laurent was doing something quiet and efficient. The city outside was moving through its evening. "I don't want to talk about what happens after," I said. "Not yet. I know we have to. But not tonight." He looked at me for a long time. "Not tonight," he agreed. "Tonight I want to eat dinner in that dining room," I said. "And then I want to sit in the small room. And I want tomorrow to not arrive any faster than it has to." Something in his face, the area around his eyes, made a small change that I recognized as the thing that happened when he was moved by something and was not performing the response to it. "All right," he said quietly. "That is what we'll do." It was the simplest sentence, and it held more than sentences usually hold, the acceptance of a present tense over a future negotiation. The choice to be in a room rather than in the calculus of what the room would eventually require. We had dinner in the dining room, which was still too large for 2 people, and had stopped feeling that way. Laurent had made something that was Italian in origin and careful in execution. Dorian sat with his wine he wouldn't finish, and watched me eat with the particular attention of someone who has found, in a simple thing, something they hadn't expected to find valuable. We talked about small things. My grandmother, a city he had been in during a century I could only imagine. A book we had both read, him long before me, and what we had each thought of it, and then the small warm room, the worn chair and the floor beside it where I sat with my back against the chair's leg and my book open in my lap. He sat in the chair and read over my head, and the lamp was on, and the house was its own kind of quiet, the full kind. Day 7 was coming. I could feel it, the way you feel the end of good things, not with dread exactly, but with the specific heightened attention of someone who knows that what they are experiencing is finite, and who, because of that knowledge, is seeing it with a clarity they might not have managed otherwise. His hand came to rest, very lightly, on my shoulder. Not a gesture, just a placement. The way you put your hand on something real. I put mine over it. We stayed like that while the last night arranged itself around us, and neither of us said anything about what came next, because we had agreed not to, and because we were both, in our different ways, people who keep their word. Day 7 arrived without asking. I woke to the specific quality of light that means morning has been going on for some time without you, and lay still in the white linen of the 4-poster bed and looked at the ceiling and made no attempt to rush the next part. There was no rushing possible. Day 7 was a fact. I dressed carefully. Not the gown, not the evening clothes, the charcoal jacket, a simple dark dress beneath it, my own things. The necklace, the dark stone he had put at my throat before the conclave, I left on. I hadn't decided to leave it on. My hand simply hadn't taken it off. He was in the sunroom. Of course he was. Breakfast was laid. He stood at the window looking at the garden with his hands in his jacket pockets, the posture of someone who has been standing in this window for some time and is aware of it. He turned when I came in. We looked at each other. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," I said. We sat down, and Laurent brought coffee, and we were quiet with it for a moment that extended itself with the mutual permission of 2 people who are not avoiding the next thing, but are allowing the current thing its full weight before it ends. "I've been thinking," I said, "about what you said. The room that isn't quiet, because it's empty." He looked at me. "I think you've been expecting," I said carefully, "that the answer to that is someone who stays permanently, who becomes part of the architecture." I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup. But I wonder if it's simpler. I wonder if what makes a room the right kind of quiet is just knowing the person will come back. He was very still. "I live in a city now," I said. "Specifically this one. As of 3 days ago, I actually want to be here, which is new." I met his eyes. "I have a job at a bar 12 minutes from these iron gates." "Sarah," he said, and his voice had the careful quality of someone handling something fragile. "I'm not asking to stay," I said. "I'm not renegotiating the terms. I'm just—" I stopped. Started again. "I'm saying that the terms assumed an ending, and I'm not sure endings are the right category for this." He looked at me for a long time. The morning light came through the sunroom glass and made the garden look exactly as impermanent and eternal as it was. "What category would you use?" he asked. A beginning, I said. A complicated one. An unusual one. I looked at him steadily. But a real one. He reached across the table. Not fast. Not dramatically. The way he did most things, with the certainty of someone who has decided. He put his hand over mine, and it was cold, and I was warm, and the contact between those two things had become, in 7 days, something that felt specifically like itself, rather than like anything else. You said, he murmured, on day 3, that you hadn't stopped counting the days. I said I stopped counting them. I corrected. Yes, he said. You did. I was right, I said. They don't count anymore. Not as a countdown. He turned my hand over, palm up, his cold fingers tracing the inside of my wrist once, a deliberate gesture, learning the geography of a place. I have not, he said quietly, been someone who permitted himself to hope for things without strategic justification in a very long time. I know, I said. I find, he said, looking at my palm, that I am making an exception. Good, I said. He looked up at me, and what was in his face was not the careful composure of the Vampire King, who had walked into the midnight lace and rearranged the temperature of the room. It was something older than that, and less managed. The thing underneath the centuries of cultivated stillness, the thing that had been there before he learned to keep it behind a locked distance. He had stopped pretending. Not just on day 3, I realized. Day 3 had been when I noticed. The stopping had been happening from the moment he had sat across from me in that booth and asked me to look at him as though I knew him, and found, in the looking, that something in him looked back. Laurent appeared in the doorway. Miss Calloway, she said, in her particular neutral voice. The car is ready when you are. Dorian looked at me, a question he was not asking because he already knew the answer and was waiting for me to say it. Tell Laurent, I said to him, watching his face, that I need a few more minutes. He turned to Laurent. Give her an hour, he said. Laurent, who had seen many things in this house across many years, received this information without visible reaction. Of course, she said, and withdrew. I stood up. He stood with me, which he always did, the reflex of someone for whom standing when others stand is older than memory. I stepped around the table to his side, and the cold of him was immediate and familiar, a climate I had adjusted to without noticing the adjustment. An hour isn't very long, I said. No, he agreed. He lifted his hand and touched my face, just the edge of his thumb along my jaw, cold and deliberate. But it is what it is. And tomorrow? I said. Tomorrow, he said. You'll come back. Not a question, but not a command either. Something in between, something that lived in the territory between certainty and hope, where real things grow when they are given time and honesty and the specific courage of choosing something that has no guaranteed outcome. Yes, I said. I will. He kissed me. Not the calculated placement of the night in the small room, not the forehead in the darkened hallway, but properly, with the full, unhurried attention of someone who has decided that a thing is worth the vulnerability of doing it completely. His hands were cold at my face, and I leaned into them because cold had stopped meaning absence of warmth. His cold was its own thing, specific and his. When we came apart, his forehead came to rest against mine, which he had done before, which felt, when it happened, like a translation of something that didn't have words yet. Day 7, I said. Day 7, he said. What comes after 7? I said. He was quiet for a moment. And then, in the voice that was his truest register, the one without performance or management, he said, everything. I sat in the black car 1 hour later and watched the iron gates close behind me through the tinted window. Laurent drove without comment, which I appreciated. The city moved past, morning bright and generous with its light, the way New Orleans light is generous, as if it has decided the world deserves the attention. I had $42 when I'd arrived. I had considerably more than that now, the amount he'd agreed to, sitting in an envelope in my bag that I would take out and look at later and feel the specific complicated weight of. But it was not the amount I was thinking about. I was thinking about the small warm room. The worn chair. The particular cold of a hand that holds things carefully because it has learned that careful holding is the only kind that keeps. I was thinking about what comes after 7. I pressed my palm against the window glass as the car turned onto Rue Dauphine, the same street where I had arrived with a rolling suitcase and $42, and a piece of paper with an address that was supposed to be my new beginning. It had been, as it turned out, exactly that, just not in any of the directions I'd been looking. Outside, the city went on doing what cities do when you're not watching, being itself. The wrought iron and the magnolias and the river-warm air, all of it unchanged and entirely different, the way everything is when you have changed inside of it. The car pulled up in front of the Midnight Lace. I got out. I stood on the street for a moment, with my bag on my shoulder. Then I went inside. Margot looked up from the bar. She looked at me the way she had on the first night, the way I now knew was not concealed alarm, but recognition, reading something she had read before. "Well," she said. "Well," I said. She looked at me for a moment, then at my neck, at the dark stone on its fine chain. Something in her face made the very small change of someone who has seen a thing end many times and is looking at the evidence that this time it did not. 8 o'clock? She said. 8 o'clock, I confirmed. I went to the staff room and put down my bag and stood in front of the mirror and looked at the dark stone at my throat and thought about a man in a house behind iron gates who was, right now, standing in the entrance hall where a lamp was always burning, in the particular quiet of a room that is waiting for something rather than empty of it. Tomorrow, I had said. And the day after, and the day after that, and all the days in whatever configuration they arrived, unmeasured and uncounted, given freely to something that had no terms anymore, except the real ones, the ones that don't expire. 3 weeks later, I learned that Rival's withdrawal had not been the end of it. Margot told me, in the specific roundabout way she delivered information she thought I needed, without believing I would welcome it, that there had been movement in the networks that she described only as the networks, the word carrying its full implication of something extensive and not entirely human. She said it while polishing glasses, her eyes on the task, her attention on me. "What kind of movement?" I asked. "The kind that follows a show of strength," she said. "People deciding which way to lean." She set the glass down. He made an impression at the conclave. Or rather, she looked at me. "You both did." "I was just there," I said. "You were the argument," she said, with the precision of someone who has watched this world long enough to understand its grammar. He has argued before. With territory and force, and the accumulated weight of centuries. This time, he argued with something else. She picked up another glass. "It reads differently." I didn't answer. I was thinking about a letter that had arrived at the bar 3 days after I'd returned, written in handwriting that moved across the page like it had somewhere important to be. It was not a long letter. It did not attempt to be more than it was. It said, "The house is different in the morning, without the sound of someone reading. I have been made aware of the difference only by having known the alternative. This is your fault specifically." D, and below that, in different ink as if added after, "The small room is still warm. It waits." I had read it 4 times, and then folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket, and left it there. He came to the bar on Thursday, Not with the arrival that dissolved a room, not with the full weight of what he was, deployed. He came in quietly, with the door held briefly open, and the night air moving through before he closed it, and he sat at the bar in a seat that was not the private booth, because the private booth was for the performance, and this was not a performance. I set a glass on the bar in front of him. He looked at it. "You don't drink," I said. "No," he said. "But you come in," I said. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He looked at me across the bar, in the amber light of the midnight lace, with the saxophone doing its particular thing in the humid air, and the lies of 100 conversations making their soft noise in the background that only I could hear. "You know why," he said. I did, but I wanted to hear it. "Because this is where you are," he said. I leaned against the bar. "The morning things," I said. "The sunroom. That happens here too, if you want." He looked at me. "I have the mornings before 8, I said. "There's a place 2 streets over that makes very good coffee. Not the lace quality, but real." 2 streets, he said. "It has a courtyard," I said. His mouth moved. The thing that wasn't quite a smile, the one that was its antechamber. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," I agreed. On the 4th Thursday, he brought a book. He set it on the bar while I worked, open to where he had stopped, and read in the amber light while the bar did what bars do at that hour. No performance, no management. A man with a book in a room that contained someone he had chosen. I moved up and down the bar and did my work, and when I passed close enough I could feel the cold of him, which was not absence but presence, specific and particular and his. Margot found me in the back at midnight. "You hum," she said, "when you're making drinks now." "Just barely." She looked at me with the expression I had been learning to read as her version of warmth, which did not use the same muscles as most people's warmth but meant the same thing. Like a frequency. "Someone told me that," I said. "What did you say?" I said I didn't. I said, "I was wrong." She shook her head, the very small shake of someone who is not surprised, but is registering a thing that matters. "Go on then," she said. I went back out to the bar. He was still there, reading in the amber light, cold and present, and choosing this room the way I had chosen it, because the person was in it, because presence had turned out to be the argument neither of us had known we were making. I poured 2 glasses of water and set one near his elbow. He looked up. "You said," I told him, refilling something at the next station, "that you didn't deal in beliefs, only facts." "I did say that," he agreed. "The fact," I said, not looking at him, attending to my work, "is that you've been here every Thursday for 4 weeks." "Yes," he said. "The fact," I said, "is that the morning coffee tomorrow is at 8. "I'll be there at 7:58, he said. "I know," I said. I did know, because that was the fact of him. 2 minutes early, ready before required. The specific diligence of someone for whom time is no longer something to manage, but has become, in this particular application, something to want. I went to the far end of the bar and worked. The lace did its amber, velvet saxophone thing around us. The lies hummed their soft noise. And at my bar, in a seat he had begun to think of as his in the way people think of things they return to by choice, the vampire king of New Orleans sat with a glass of water he wouldn't drink, and a book he was reading, and the specific quality of stillness that is not emptiness, but its opposite. A room that was quiet because it was full. I had arrived in this city with $42 and a piece of paper. I had found what the piece of paper couldn't tell me was here. Not a job, not a beginning in the way I'd meant it, but the other kind. The kind that doesn't have terms. The kind that doesn't count down because it isn't counting at all, just moving forward the way real things move, day into unremarkable, ordinary, extraordinary day. 7 days had been the agreement. What came after 7 was not in any agreement. It was better than that. It was chosen.